Welcome everyone to the first module of SAFE's S.M.A.R.T Advocacy Training Series. My name is Chris Macy. I work for the Irish Heart Foundation in Dublin, and I'm a member of the SAFE board. So just before we start, I'd like to ask you all to make sure your mics are muted and your cameras are off when you're not speaking, that you've logged in, hopefully with your first and last names so we can see who everyone is, and you submit your questions via the chat function. We'll have 10 minutes for questions after each presentation. When your question's introduced, please then unmute and turn on your camera. Also, this session, just to let you know, is being recorded and it'll be visible online at a later date. So S.M.A.R.T is a 4-module series that's been designed to help stroke support organizations and everyone committed to improving stroke services and making sure that stroke survivors can live the best lives possible. Specifically, these sessions are for all of us who are seeking to persuade the departments of health and governments in our respective countries to implement the Stroke Action Plan for Europe. Stroke is the world's second biggest killer disease. Every year, 17 million people have a stroke, but in all our countries, stroke is much too far down the list of health priorities. It's chronically under-resourced compared even to conditions responsible for a fraction of the death, disability and devastation to families that stroke causes. And the only people who are going to change that are ourselves, SSOs, stroke survivors and stroke professionals. And I suppose whatever country we live in, it's in our interest to help each other because every success in any country is a success for us all. For example, if the right for stroke patients to have a rehabilitation and sector transition plan when they're discharged is established in Serbia or in Iceland or in Portugal, it's going to help me in Ireland because I can show my Department of Health how they're falling behind and not looking after stroke survivors as well as in other countries. So I suppose if we can make some big waves through the Stroke Action Plan for Europe, together we can create a tide that can lift all our boats and improve the situation for stroke survivors and stroke patients in all of our countries. Today, we're very lucky to have 3 speakers, Emma Cracknell, Alberto Alemano and Kelsey Belts, all of whom are experts of international stature in the fields of public affairs, communications, advocacy and lobbying. They've huge knowledge and experience in terms of the actions and approaches that we need to take to further the cause of everyone in Europe affected by stroke. And I want just to start off by thanking all of them for giving us the benefit of their expertise today. And finally, before I introduce Emma, I'd like to thank the sponsors who've made this series possible. And they are Amgen, Bayer, Boehringer Ingelheim, and BMS Pfizer. Emma is going to speak to us about strategic advocacy by, with and for patients, how the voice of patients can change the political future. Emma is currently Vice President and Head of Healthcare at Fleischmann Hillard in Brussels. With 10 years experience of public affairs and communications experience, Emma specializes in the development and execution of EU public affairs strategies, including multi-market disease awareness campaigns. A significant part of Emma's role is focused on designing and delivering capabilities, strengthening trainings to empower patient representatives to have a voice in health policy. So Emma's going to speak for 25 minutes, and as I said before, there'll be 10 minutes for questions afterwards, and please put those questions into the chat function. So Emma, thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Chris. And just for everybody's reference, I'm going to keep this to 20 minutes to keep us in time. I am going to share my screen now. And I'm going to put this in slideshow format. Is everybody able to see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yes.
Great, then I will start. So thank you so much, everybody, for inviting me to be here today. It's very much appreciated, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you all. So what I'm going to speak to you today really is about the why. So why patient advocacy is important for the future of our healthcare systems, and why it's so important for your goals as stroke support organisations. So first, let's bring this back to basics. What does advocacy mean? And what is a patient advocate? So as you can see from the image on the screen, patient advocacy work can roughly be divided into 5 categories. One is fundraising, so either for the organisation you represent or for money to be channeled into the research of your therapy area. The second is research, so conducting research into the disease area you represent. 3 is supporting patients in their day-to-day lives. 4 is watchdog, so I like to describe this as championing safe care for patients. And the 5th is political. So in the context of helping stroke support organisations advocate for the implementation of the Stroke Action Plan for Europe in your countries, today we're going to specifically focus on political advocacy. So I will take you to the next slide. So I think really what's important to describe now is, what does political patient advocacy mean? And I really wanted to bring this right back to the beginning and help everybody be on the exact same page of what this means, because you will find so many definitions on the internet of what's political patient advocacy. So let's look at the base definition. So by definition, this is the public support for or recommendation of a particular cause or policy. It involves engaging others, exercising your voice as an expert in your disease area, and mobilizing evidence to influence policy and practice. It specifically entails participating directly or indirectly in political or policy processes, and acknowledging the importance of evidence, power, and politics in advancing policy options. But the key things I would like you to take away from that are what you will see on the screen. For me, they're the main messages. So what's important? Patient advocates advocate for legislative changes that benefit patients. They bring patient expertise, and patient expertise is something I would like you to remember throughout my presentation. It's incredibly important. Patient expertise and priorities to the table for discussion and consideration by policymakers when formulating or amending existing policy. And for me, this is critical. What happens if we don't have the patient voice? Without the patient voice, we risk healthcare systems and policies that do not reflect patient needs. And everything that we do in healthcare systems, when it's formulating medicines, when it's discussing healthcare policy at the table, whether that's at a national level or pan-European level, it all should be about the patient. And without the patient voice, it's hard to make that a reality. So moving forward, I apologize because my PowerPoint freezes a little, but for me, it's, why is the patient voice so important in healthcare systems? And that's something that I would really like to reiterate, because it's a conversation that can be difficult to have sometimes. And I think it's a conversation that is still relatively new. I think patient advocacy is something that we all know we should be doing. It's something that policymakers are increasingly asking for. But I think those reasons for why patient advocacy is central to the evolution of health policy are right here on the slide. And one is that it improves health services offered to patients and their quality of life. The second is that it identifies and addresses inefficiencies and redundancies in healthcare systems. So we can touch on this a little later, but that is more important now than ever with the impact of the pandemic and COVID-19. Policymakers are increasingly looking for ways to address inefficiencies and redundancies because it all comes down to costs. And I personally think that patient involvement and patient advocacy has a big part to play in that, because you can have those honest conversations with policymakers and you can say to them, this is relevant for us or this isn't relevant for us. And it comes from honesty and expertise. It also helps to diversify perspectives and approaches to health policy. So, for example, making sure we have policies that consider the whole patient pathway, from diagnosis and screening, prevention, rehabilitation, treatment. We should be having policies that look at all 5 aspects and beyond. And that's something that we really need the patient voice for. And finally, and this again, incredibly important, it increases patient trust in healthcare systems and medicinal products. And that means better health outcomes and success of treatments. Without trust, patients don't trust the healthcare systems and don't necessarily trust the advice that they're being given. And in order for our healthcare ecosystem to work, that trust is really important. And something that I've highlighted at the bottom of the slide that, again, I would like to really highlight to everybody on this call is patients are experts by experience. As a patient, you deal with your health condition on a daily basis, and you're in regular contact with healthcare systems. And that means that you have a deep understanding of how health affects all aspects of life. And only patients can bring that to the table in a policy conversation. Not policymakers, not industry, not media, it's the patients. They have the experience and they are experts by experience. So moving on. Why do we need the patient voice to effectively implement the stroke action plan for Europe? So what I'm outlining in this slide and what I'd like to talk to you about here is essentially built off the back of all those points I've just presented to you about why the patient voice is so critical in the evolution of health policy. I want to take that and contextualize it to where we are today. Where are we in May 2021 when it comes to the healthcare environment in both Europe at a national level and broadly internationally? Where are we, and what does this mean for the prioritization of stroke and the implementation of the stroke action plan for Europe? So first, countries have facing limited healthcare budgets due to an aging population and a rise in chronic diseases. This is a message that we've been hearing for a long time now, far before the pandemic hit, that healthcare budgets are limited. And it's because we're getting older and we're not always getting healthier. And we have a rise in chronic diseases, can be linked to all sorts of different lifestyle factors, but also genetic factors. And whilst our budgets are constrained and healthcare budgets are tight, healthcare decision makers are going to only have a certain amount of money to spend at any one time. And that means all different policy areas, all different therapy areas are going to be fighting for space on the policy agenda. A healthcare policy maker perhaps meets with 9 or 10 different people a day, speaking about 9 or 10 different diseases. So how do you prioritize stroke? How do you prioritize what matters to you? And that's done by effective patient advocacy. And if patient advocacy is not happening, then you don't have a seat at the table, and that can mean that your issues can be overlooked. And that's why this training course that Stroke Alliance for Europe has put together is so important. And I'm very much an advocate and a fan of working very closely with patient groups to upscale how you can be more effective in these conversations and how we can make that really land. And that really leads to the next point that I have on the screen, which is it's difficult to get therapy areas actually beyond cancer prioritized on national health agendas, if I'm totally honest with you. Cancer is considered as the most costly disease on Europe's healthcare systems. And if you are to have a conversation with any European policymaker, I can guarantee you 9 times out of 10 that cancer is at the top of their list. And we see this as well, and it's filtering down from an EU level where the Europe's Beating Cancer Plan is the priority of the European Commission right now. I know that health belongs to the member states, but it's influenced by the decision and political direction from Brussels. So cancer is something that is always on the agenda, and is something that we need to make sure that we're effectively advocating for stroke and other disease areas to also be on the agenda. I also think that the patient voice is important, and the reason we need it today is to ensure access to latest scientific research on stroke treatment and prevention. And I think it's the patient advocacy groups that can be driving that investment in research, can be putting forward the arguments as to why investment in stroke prevention and research and treatment is so important. And the final reason that I think is also incredibly relevant for everybody on this call, specifically for this forum that we're speaking in today, is that if we don't advocate together as a group, you risk a lot of different stakeholders approaching policymakers on the same topic and having different messages. Different messages are less effective than cohesive messages. We say in communications, repetition equals retention. If you say the same message enough times, it should eventually land and be retained by your stakeholders. So I think it's really important that we remember, and I think you remember throughout the training program that you're going to be taking part in, that one cohesive and united message amongst groups across Europe is really the most powerful tool. One final point for me before I'm going to show you some examples is I thought it would be useful to quickly revisit how health is managed in Europe, and therefore where are your advocacy opportunities. I don't want to go into this into too detail because I understand that speakers will present moving forward on your access opportunities, but I think that this is an interesting slide and something that I wanted to talk to. And most of you will know everything that I'm already about to present. So this is really just a reminder. And it's just in the context of advocating for and implementing the Stroke Action Plan. So one, the organisation and delivery of healthcare and pricing and reimbursement decisions are the responsibility of national governments. However, the European Union complements national policies by helping them achieve shared objectives, generating economies of scale, pooling resources, and helping countries tackle common challenges. I've already mentioned a rise in chronic diseases and also aging population. They're issues that all of the countries currently share. And finally, patient advocacy groups are active at both a national and pan-European level, and policymakers are calling for their increased involvement in the policy-making process. And that's coming from all levels. That's coming from the medicine evaluation process. So if you're looking at the European Medicines Agency, all the way into the development and formulation of policies. So looking at national ministries of health, the European Parliament, the European Commission, but also in perhaps more technical areas such as health technology assessment. The patient voice is increasingly considered as, one of the most important factors, because if the patient voice isn't there, how do you judge what the patient relevant factors are when you're making a decision on whether a medicine should come to market? And I think that's ultimately what it's about. If we don't have patient voice in the room, how do we judge what's actually helpful and useful for patients? And if we can't do that, then our healthcare policies are ineffective. So my key message and my key takeaway on this slide is opportunities for advocacy activities at national and a European level. So from my side, that's really an overview of what I wanted to talk to you about today, which is the why. Why is it so important that patient advocacy groups are active and actively involved in policy and decision making and healthcare? But something that I thought might be useful would be to show you a few different examples of patient advocacy activities that I've specifically worked on over the past few years, which means I can give you some answers to any questions that you have. And I've also tried to diversify this between big tactics, so big expensive tactics that really throwing all resources into it, but at the same time much more simple tactics that can be done that are as effective but just different and much easier to implement with smaller resources. The first one that I wanted to talk to you about, and we will be sharing the decks after the presentation today, so you can actually click on the links when I share it, because I think it's a really cool video to watch, is a project called the Misunderstood Sensory Cafe. You may have heard of it, but if not, I'm going to explain anyway. So the Misunderstood Sensory Cafe was a cafe that was designed in Dublin. And it was a sensory cafe, and it was designed for all that attended it to have a sensory experience linked to multiple sclerosis. So to put that into context, that meant that when you walked into the cafe, that some of the tables were a bit slanted. It was difficult to sit on the chairs. You went to pay for your coffee, and the counter kept moving, and it just made everything a little bit harder. And what it did for everybody that went to visit that cafe, it showed them what it was like to live with a chronic condition like MS and how that felt in everyday activities. And the design that the campaign idea was to shock. So it was to shock those that visited, and it was also to get the attention of policymakers in Ireland. So at the time, and I didn't personally work on this, it was my team that did, but from what I understand at the time, multiple sclerosis was on the political agenda. People were talking about it, and it was ahead of decisions on investment in MS therapies. So this cafe ran for a day, and then it was adapted on a specifically designed bus, which was on the road for 10 days and visited 13 locations throughout Ireland. And the next step for the Misunderstood Cafe is for it actually to tour Europe. So you might think to yourself, okay, very exciting tactic, very different, but what was the impact? So as I put on the slide, within hours of the cafe opening, access had been put on the political agenda, so access to medicines for MS patients. 2 ministers wrote to the Minister for Health requesting healthcare market changes. 60 parliamentary questions were tabled about improving access to MS treatment. And the Minister for Health met with MS Ireland to discuss the most effective ways to improve access to MS medicines. The video online received 13 million plus impressions within the next year of the video being up. I think it was actually much quicker than that. I think the test was taken within weeks of the video going up. So this can really be shown as one of those big advocacy activities that had a big impact and changed the conversation at a national level in Ireland. So that's one of the big examples that I wanted to show you, because I think it's a really cool example, and it's received a lot of praise, and I think it was a very different thing to do. But of course, there aren't always budgets to do activities like that, and activities like that happen once every now and again. They don't happen every day. And we want to work with, we want to work and develop patient advocacy programs that can be done every single day. So I wanted to show you some slightly smaller tactics that we've worked on that were equally effective from my perspective, and were a lot less resource and time intensive. So we had supported the European Heart Network ahead of the parliamentary elections in 2000, and I want to say 2015 or 16, but I feel like with coronavirus, time is no longer something that you're able to manage. The last parliamentary elections, but what we did is we worked with the European Heart Network to put forward their position on what should be featured in the European health policy agenda. So we worked with them on key asks and deliverables and what we think should change for heart patients across Europe. And then after we had developed the manifesto, you can see some screenshots on the screen right now. We then worked with this group to present this manifesto to MEPs. So we had patient advocacy representatives going to the MEPs and putting forward their priorities in a structured manner. And what the policymakers liked about this is that it recognised their agenda as well. And we are working with policymakers. It's important to them that they feel that their agenda is recognised. But it worked for their agenda, and it also worked in terms of allowing the European Heart Network and its members to put forward a structured approach, debate forward to the European elections. And then I'm going to show you just one more, and then we have time for questions. So this was another example of patient advocacy tactics, which was based on patient stories. So essentially, this is MedTech, is online, it's easily accessible, anybody can access it. But the design and the purpose behind this is MedTech was to put forward patient stories of those patients that were using medical devices in some way. And what we aim to do with this forum, with this website, was add a personal touch to those who are experiencing a range of conditions and their everyday lives with medical technology, and why continued research and investment in medical technology was so important to improving patients' lives. So again, a nice tactic, bringing forward the patient voice, something that's been referred to by policymakers since, something that's been able to be used in conversations with policymakers, but not something as extensive or as intense as the the Misunderstood Cafe. So I'm at 20 minutes, which is, I promised you how long I would talk for, and I would now love to hand it over or back to the moderator for questions, however we would like to proceed.
Thanks a million, Emma. That was really interesting, really informative, and thanks a million. So everyone, put your questions in on the chat, and I will relay them to Emma. I suppose just firstly, Emma, do you think yourself that patient involvement has an impact on health policy outcomes?
I do, absolutely. And I want to say, from a perspective of what happens when patient groups are not in the room. And when patient groups are not in the room, you risk a discussion around therapy areas, and the whole patient pathway from treatment to rehabilitation to diagnosis. You risk having that conversation without the one person that matters in that conversation, and that's the patient and the impact on the patient. And as I mentioned in my presentation, but I think that this is important, is that there is an increasing call from policymakers to bring in the patient voice for that reason specifically. It's being recognized at an international, a European, and a national level that the patient voice is critical to the development of health policies. So yeah, yes, I really do think it has a big impact in the way that we see our healthcare policies being delivered today.
So just following on from that, do you think it's important, Emma, to, when you're going in to talk to a politician as a patient advocate, to put yourself in their shoes and think about what's in it for them, as opposed to just what's in it for me, and how can I help them fulfill their goals?
I do. And I think the best way to describe this, and something that we give as advice, is that all relationships, think of any relationship in your life, is always a two-way transaction. No relationship should be based, whether it's friends or partners or parents, should be based on one person giving and the other person not giving back. So if you think of a relationship with a policymaker as in terms of the basic psychology as a relationship with anybody, when you approach that policymaker, you also need to make clear what's in it for them. And I think, as a patient representative, that win is actually pretty easy for them, because as a policymaker, they should want to be seen to be supporting patient groups and supporting non-governmental organizations, civil action groups around their particular diseases and their causes, but also because health is higher on the political agenda than it has ever been before. But I completely agree with you, Chris. You cannot have that conversation with a policymaker without understanding what that policymaker wants to hear and what their priorities are too. So matching your priorities with their priorities is perhaps the best way to describe that.
And just, I suppose, patients actually directly advocating is really important, because it creates that emotional connection between
Absolutely.
the whatever disease it is, in our case stroke, and what the policymaker can do. But could you just tell me about the importance as well of the sort of the economic, you touched on it in your talk, the cost benefit importance, and the need to show that it's actually cost effective to introduce some of these services. We always say with stroke that it's actually cheaper to treat it well than to treat it badly, because it stops that much bigger cost in nursing homes that you can address at a much earlier stage. So if you'd have any advice for people on how to get that economic information, how to present it, that would be great.
So I think, to speak totally candid, and I'm here as Emma Cracknell today, so as a person, not as a company, and I think that's clear to underline. I think it's very difficult to have a conversation with a policymaker right now without acknowledging the economic situation. And that's because the reality of today is that we are dealing with small healthcare budgets at a national level, a pan-European level as well, that they are tight and they are squeezed. And right now they are very, very focused on what policymakers see as their biggest priority, which is ending this pandemic, which is damaging both economically and socially for them. I think that conversation is very important. Now, in terms of research, I think exactly what you said, Chris, it's almost as if presenting that cost of non-treatment is what policymakers want to hear. And I think the most impactful way to do that is to walk into the room and say, the cost of stroke to Europe each year is X. And these figures are often available by the World Health Organization, the groups that you're working with. You don't need lots and lots of statistics. I think on that first conversation, you can go in 1, 2, 3 maximum statistics of this is the cost of stroke. And this is what we can do to mitigate that cost. And by you investing in stroke patients, stroke therapy area, that is how we can look to challenge this. And in the long term, make this a lot less costly for society as a disease area.
Great. And just one final question, Emma. I think a lot of people want to know the answer to this. Is
Yeah.
what are the elements that make a good patient advocate?
So for me, I think it is beginning with communication, being a clear communicator. And I think by clear communicator, what I think is important, maybe if there was one takeaway for everybody to remember, is when you have a conversation with a policymaker, they are not an expert in a specific disease area. They are not an expert in medicine. Often they are not doctors. Sometimes they are doctors and you get lucky, but often they're not. When you go in being incredibly clear and thinking about the 3 messages you want to communicate, and not just going in and just showering them in the detail, because you will lose them. It's going in again, and back to what I was saying before, thinking about what's important to them, which from the beginning is right now is the economic cost. Clearly communicating on that and how that impacts you as a patient as well, and what you would like to see changing. So I think it's the very clear communications, not going too much into the detail because you will lose policymakers. And that's something I'm telling even my teammates, when you're going forward, don't shower them in details, because the human brain can only retain a certain amount of statistics. And it's also thinking about these, like I said, these relationships as you think about your relationships in everyday life. And it's that you go forward and you want to build a relationship. So I say the best patient advocates aren't the ones that just have a one-off meeting with a policymaker. They're the ones that look to build that relationship long term. So they find reasons to continue the conversation, to continue to bring in evidence that will help that policymaker in their discussions and make it a mutually beneficial relationship. I hope that's helpful.
That's a great answer, and thanks a million. And
No problem.
and Emma, I just want to thank you again on behalf of everyone in SAFE and everyone at the meeting today for giving your time to us, and your expertise was really interesting and I think beneficial for all of us. Thanks very much.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me.
So we're going to move on now to our next speaker. Just before we do that, I just wanted to tell you or remind people that we have an online learning tool in SAFE called SOFT that's designed to help anyone interested in advocacy or even in terms of setting up a support organization. There's a load of useful information on it, on areas such as what advocacy is, how to use evidence, how to make your case for change, role of the patient voice, how to use media, things like that, and some of the things that Emma touched on there. So I'm sure the details on how to access that can be put up for anyone who hasn't seen it already. And for I suppose a lot of us have been in and out of it over the last couple of years that we've had it, and so it's just to remind everyone that it's there. So next, I'd like to introduce Alberto Alemano, who is the founder and director of the Good Lobby. He's also the Jean Monnet Professor of European Law and Public Policy at HEC Paris Business School since 2009. He's an Ashoka Fellow, and because of his unique expertise in non-profit advocacy, in the non-profit advocacy sector, he was recently invited to join the OECD Coalition of Influencers. Alberto will be speaking to us today on the topic of step-by-step towards an effective advocacy strategy, introducing the elements of a strong advocacy strategy, looking at the bigger picture, how to identify connections between different advocacy elements. So I'll just introduce Alberto now, and just to say that after his presentation and the question and answer session, we'll be taking a 5-minute break. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today, at least virtually. As you've heard, my entry point into advocacy is to be an academic whose research, in particular in public health matters, led to turn into a fully fledged organization, which is the Good Lobby. Our mission is really to strengthen civil society organizations, but also in particular citizen and citizen movements to basically become advocate, to become actors of change, in particular when engaging with decision making. So this is the mission statement of the Good Lobby, a civic startup based in Brussels, but with offices also in Milan, in Paris, and in Spain, where I'm connecting today. The philosophy underpinning the Good Lobby work and what you're going to be hearing today in terms of methodology comes straight from the book I wrote a few years ago, Lobbying for Change, Find Your Voice to Create a Better Society, that really offers you a possible way into public policy and how to influence it. So it is against this backdrop that I am pleased to be with you today and to introduce some key elements of that might lead to the development of an advocacy strategy that might potentially identify connections in your own advocacy ecosystem and help you create an advocacy plan. Obviously, I'm here to introduce those concepts. We're not going to go into the details, but hopefully I will be able to give you an initial exposure, an initial introduction that will inspire and potentially provide an analytical framework that you will be able to follow. And perhaps many of you are already following in their day-to-day advocacy as a patient advocate. So let me perhaps build on what Emma said and give you my own perspective on semantics, because many people ask me, what is lobbying? Why you're talking about advocacy? Why NGOs and citizens like advocacy and big corporations like lobbying? What is the difference between the two? And what is about activism? What's the relationship between advocacy and activism? So I don't know whether you want to use the chat to provide some tentative answers to my question. What's the difference between lobbying and advocacy? Let's focus perhaps on this one, which is a tough one. Anybody who would like to share some ideas, even just a buzzword, a keyword, selling? What is the division of labor between the two? I don't see entry. Anybody would like to try? Just use the chat. That would be the easiest. Okay, so Simone is talking about influence. Influence is about what? Advocacy or lobbying? Well, both of them, they try to exercise influence. We have already heard from Emma that advocacy is really about shaping the conversation, feeding the policymakers with information, data. Anybody else who would like to give it a try? Well, I don't see a lot of enthusiasm. I don't know whether this is a sign that everything is already clear or there's a major confusion around it. So my job today is really, muchas gracias, Natalia. I see some entries here. Yes, this is my way of looking at things, which is pretty much based on the literature coming from political science that basically say, you know, everything is activism. This includes also protest. It includes any form of engagement, cultural performance that somehow communicate dissatisfaction or a particular agenda into the public space, right? But then when you look at more specifically at the attempt of shaping that agenda, we talk more about advocacy, right? Somebody in protesting in the street is probably not an advocate, is an activist only. But then within advocacy, we have another circle, which is much more niche and much more specific to it, which is called lobbying. And lobbying really is about advocacy aimed at decision makers taking or omitting to take decisions. So when we engage with decision makers directly, sometimes also indirectly, but our target and only target is decision makers, then we are lobbying. And you know what? As we will see in the coming slides, there's nothing wrong to be lobbyist. Lobby is something that is part of our democracy. It's about providing information to decision makers about our preferences, our needs. In the case of the patient's community, it's really about bringing a reality to the eyes of the decision makers. So how can we define lobbying? I see here Lauren, who said, or she said, lobbying, the intent to influence policy. Advocacy is more about representing voices, and activism is about pushing for change. More or less, I think lobbying, it can also be about pushing for change. It's also about representing voices. So you're all lobbyists, but you do this only when you target exclusively decision makers. That's why we talk about advocacy, because what you do and what you are supposed to do goes beyond decision makers' influence. You are changing the narrative. You're shaping the way in which a particular phenomena, pathologies, are perceived by society, not only by decision makers. So as you can see, this is a broader attempt at changing the rules of the game. Again, lobbying is a much more specific and narrower attempt at defining the relations existing between society and their representatives. I often say that our work as advocates really takes place in the space in between elections. Once we have expressed our vote according to representative democracy, which governs us all across Europe, we are supposed to wait for the next election to actually express our preferences. We can reward decision makers by giving them again our vote, or we can punish them. This is the theory. But obviously, in between elections, there are many more opportunities which are open to us to actually convey our messaging to decision maker. So here, the philosophy that I would like to share with you, the fact that lobbying is, first of all, a legitimizer. What does it mean? It means that today, everybody in government, in parliaments, wants to hear our voices. It's no longer like in the old days where representatives had a monopoly of knowledge and decision making. Nowadays, there are many channels of participation, public consultation, petitions, complaints that actually allow us institutionally to feed the work of decision makers. This is very important. However, many of these avenues of participation, like those I'm mentioning here now, are not very well known. They're not very well used. So I always encourage any advocate to explore what are the possibilities for you to engage with decision makers by using the different existing channels. Again, I mentioned the petitions. We could imagine also complaints, ombudsman complaints, ombudsman requests, and many other opportunities offered to us, including public consultation. Lobbying is also a great opportunity for us to become advocates for causes that actually become more tangible to decision makers. It's not only about launching a commercial petition on Avaz or on change.org, but it's really about learning and getting an exposure to decision making. Lobbying is also an equalizer. It basically allows all the interests to be heard in front of decision makers. How can policymakers take the best decision if around the table there are only a few interests and not all the interests affected by their decision? This is something that happens to patients around the world. The fact of not necessarily being in the radar screen of the decision makers. So all actors, you know, from WWF to Google to Coca-Cola to Scientology to countries and local communities are all somehow called upon to play a role in our society. Does this mean that today only business is actually advocating for the interest? In other words, is business overrepresented? Well, at the Good Lobby, we challenge that assumption. And we argue that in reality is us, civil society, diffuse interest, public health, environment, but also minority rights, which tend to be underrepresented. So basically organized interests tend to do their work. And as you have seen now, as you have heard, this is a pretty legitimate activity that everybody should be able to do. And lobbying also makes us a bit humbler because we realize the difficult trade-offs that decision makers face when adopting new policies. And in public health, this is often the case. And in the previous conversation, we already got an exposure to some of these difficult trade-off between economic matters and health matters and how we can possibly strike a balance between the two. Last but not least, and this is very counterintuitive, any form of advocacy and lobbying is also positive for democracy. So we have a lot of literature suggesting that societies and even European countries, which are inhabited by assertive citizens as opposed to allegiant citizens, citizens who basically shut up, are more transparent and accountable. So in a way, by lobbying, we are improving the state of our democracy by facilitating better decisions that really go into the public interest. This was my, let's say, attempt at demystifying lobbying. And now it comes my attempt to democratize lobbying by unpacking the toolbox of the different kind of analytical tools you can use to build your advocacy strategy as a patient group, as a patient organization, as a patient advocate. So here you can see 10 steps coming directly from the methodology that we employ, that we convey, in particular in the nonprofit advocacy space. So we work with nonprofit organizations, citizens movements, as well as philanthropies. We always say, well, at the end of the day, you don't necessarily have to follow this order, the order that I present you here from number 1 to number 10, but these are basically the things you need to do in order to build an advocacy strategy, in order to be prepared to convey your message to decision maker and to shape the conversation. So first, pick your battle. That's what you have already done. You already know basically what is your space, what is your ask. Then you need to do your homework. As Emma was anticipating, you need to gather evidence, data. You need to connect the dots among communities. And for this, we need to basically draw a map of the different stakeholders, different actors, which are there out in the advocacy space. Then you can draw a plan on what kind of courses of action you're going to be following. And then you can actually build a coalition. So you can build connections with communities, perhaps patients suffering different kind of pathologies, or even actors which are seem to be very far away from your problem, but they are not. So forth and so on. Obviously, we're not going to go into depth into each of those steps, but those are the very important ones that you need to take note of. We're going to be focusing on the first 3, and then with Kelsey, who is also working at the Good Lobby, you will have the chance to hear a few more steps in the coming minutes. So the first encouragement I always try to convey is that you need to think as a lobbyist. You no longer have to think as a citizen. You no longer have to think as a professional. You have to think as a lobbyist. In other words, what your priorities are for implementing the stroke action plan that has been already defined at the European level, right? What should you focus on? And for this, it's very important to understand and to get a grasp of what I call the policy cycle. In other words, where your agenda finds itself into this kind of chart that shows how ideas, proposals might then turn into proposals. They might be adopted, they might be implemented, it might even be adjudicated if somebody is going to challenge them in court. So the policy cycle is a very useful idea to situate yourself when you start advocating for a new plan. And then awareness that your ability to influence the process is very much linked to the so-called curve of influence. In other words, the moment in which you start advocating with the decision makers may give you more or less influence depending on the timing. So this map gives you just one illustration that reflects what happens at the European level, but at the national government might look slightly different, is the fact that you have a lot of influence at the beginning of the process, but then you lose influence as soon as decision makers start writing papers, documents, and positioning themselves. But then, as you can see in this image, there's always a bouncing back. There's a possibility to have greater influence in different processes or moments of the procedure. So it's important to be aware of what is actually the curve of influence that shape your own advocacy. When it comes to do your homework, I think Emma already highlighted the major key takeaways. You need to collect evidence, not necessarily too much evidence. but use at best what you already have and trying to figuring out what is going to resonate with your target audience. So economic figures, in your case, clearly ring a bell for the policymakers. Use them, try to collect relevant data, the most granular, the better, which actually makes sense for the area, for the region, for the geography that you are somehow occupying. So create arguments all the time. Once you've done so, as I anticipated, try to move to mapping the advocacy landscape that surrounds you. In other words, what are the actors that are somehow affected by the policy that you're pushing for or that you are preventing from happening? Depends on the circumstances. Some of them might become your allies, some might be opponents, some are just influential actors and might actually play an important role as influencers into this space. And when identifying them, be brave, don't go beyond the usual suspects. Think about unconventional actors. You in your space, you already work with companies, but this doesn't happen very often. What about working and teaming up with influencers on Instagram who already have an amazing audience and they might have a particular sensibility for a particular pathology, or because of personal reasons, they might want to position themselves. These are just ideas for expanding your own stakeholder mapping by thinking about the mission they have, the funding they have, the demographics, and their geography. So what I would advise you to do is something very simple, right? You draw a stakeholder map. On the x-axis, you put support for change on one hand, those who actually oppose change on the other, and then you try to reflect their weight and their influence by playing on the other axis. So that would basically give you a map. At one glance, you get a sense of where most of the power is, where the balance of interest lies, and every day, every week, you can take a picture of this map and it will probably look different because these are ongoing processes. So your job is really to keep track of these power dynamics that might exist across those actors and in relation to which you play a role. So the stakeholder mapping is a key tool to be used by you as an advocate. Once you've done so, you should be ready to actually define what are the possible avenues of action, right? So here there are some basic examples, right? If you want to reduce smoking, this is the issue. How you're going to do it? Well, you can ban indoor smoking, right? This is an example. But how do I get there? Well, there are different ways, right? You can decide to push for your policy option, your solution, by taking a campaign. And we already heard a few examples of campaigns. We're going to hear a few more from Kelsey. You can take a legislative stance, which is a bit more aligned to the work that historically has been done by you. It can be administrative. You bring real issues to the attention of decision makers in a strategic way, or you can go political. So you try to have this meeting with a minister or with a key influencers. It could be a European commissioner. It could be the mayor of a big city. And by doing so, you basically try to have a privileged relationship. Obviously, these avenues and tools, they're not mutually exclusive. So you can combine a campaign, which basically raises awareness, with a much more specific strategic litigation, challenging aspects of the current regulatory environment you might dislike. So you can be very creative about defining your own strategy. What is the bottom line here? I'm coming to a close by saying that at the end of the day, any good advocacy plans require some research and therefore time and some resources, but also a lot of planning and anticipation. So trying always to be one step ahead of decision makers and public opinion in order to be able to show what your proposed approach could actually solve or address problems in society. Be targeted, be smart, be agile, and that's the beauty of being citizen lobbyists, as we all are in this call, because we are certainly more agile than big organization in adapting to this advocacy landscape and to these new occurrences that might happen all the time. It's part of the profession. How do we do it at the Good Lobby? We basically accompany organizations and movements, but we also provide both pro bono and low bono support. I think it's very important to realize that any form of advocacy, even if brought up from the bottom up, requires some forms of professionalization. That's something that even organized NGOs sometimes don't see. And professionalization means to acquire tools, perspective, but also be open to the idea of receiving external help. So we always push citizen movements to rely on pro bono support, low bono support of designers, artists, professionals in the legal field, but also in public affairs, in order to receive this kind of accompaniment, which is not about executing your lobbying, but is really about giving you advice, punctual advice. And over the last 4 years, we were able to create on a pro bono basis more than 3 million euros value of legal and advocacy advice. So in our small organization, we managed to basically give support to a variety of movements that would have not found otherwise. And I think it's important to realize this is a possible way forward also for you towards your professionalization towards advocacy and good lobby. To you, Chris.
Alberto, thanks very much. That was fantastic. And certainly there are a number of your slides there that I'm going to, as we say in Ireland, pinch, or you might say plagiarize, because they're great and they really explain it superbly well. There was one thing you had up there that about coalition building that I think is really important, because it gives small organizations the chance to build their power by bringing more people in and getting more people involved, and therefore increasing their chance of influencing. I suppose it's from experience, it's easier to get a coalition together than to keep it together and keep it motivated and mobilized. And so would you have any tips for people, or could you just talk specifically about the importance of coalitions, and then just expand a little bit into tips on how you keep them going over a period of time?
This is a spot-on question, Chris, because obviously coalition by definition leverage on the resources, communities which are pre-existing to your cause. So it's always worth exploring the possibility for a coalition, but there are also a lot of downsides, and you have anticipated some of them, right? How we stay together, who is going to lead, who is going to speak on behalf. What happens if one of the members actually cross a few red lines? Well, we need to know what those red lines are. So our advice on coalition is always to be very humble about it. Try to identify one specific ask, not everything, but one specific ask, which can be runnerly defined, where everybody basically agrees, and then to analytically turn it into a memorandum of understanding. So to formalize it with some specific rules of engagement, defining division of labor, how much time, how many resources each member of the organization of the coalition will chip in. What happens if something goes wrong, to have a sort of mediation system. What is going to happen if the coalition makes no sense? Why we keep being together, it happens all the time, despite the fact you have already exhausted your mission. So all these kind of things need to be prepared, and that's what I meant by anticipation, but also following a few rule of thumbs and common sense, and trying to really figuring out who are the key actors with whom I could actually get along well. Sometimes it's better to go alone, to have a pilot just with another actor, a mini coalition, and then to open progressively. This is another way to go around. And I'm sure that many participants here, they have their own experience, and they know that, yes, it's not an easy thing to hammer down. And that's why we need to prepare at best before getting started on a coalition.
Also, I suppose just sort of following on from that, you see a lot of organizations and medical organizations. You see it quite a bit where people might go in to see a minister or a politician, and they see that then as their job is done, and the reality that change doesn't happen quickly, and the need for perseverance is sometimes lost on people. Could you just talk a little bit about how long sometimes you have to slog before you get what you're looking for, and the need constantly reinvent yourself when that happens.
Absolutely. I think that the major mistake of any advocate, including myself, is to start celebrating the meeting that I managed to get with the decision maker I want to influence, without realizing that the meeting is just the beginning of the real work. So all the work you've been doing for months, sometimes years, lend you a meeting. But the meeting sometimes doesn't go well because that decision maker won't show up. There will be her assistant or his assistant, or because you don't connect, or because you didn't prepare well. So I really insist in a very evangelical way on preparing, over preparing for your meeting, because this would basically be your chance. And preparing a meeting means to know exactly what to say, but also how to react by triggering some empathic connection with the decision maker, and then making sure that you walk out of the room with a follow-up promise, right? That kind of email, that kind of report, that kind of information that really allow you to build on that meeting. But you cannot imagine how many mistakes I've been making over the years by just, getting carried away by the meeting, and then, showing up late, leaving the meeting without anything in my pocket. Disaster. So yes, be prepared to be persistent.
One of the mistakes I've made, Alberto, going in to talk to politicians is going in and expecting them to have the answer to my problem rather than having the solution myself. Can you just talk about how important it is to have a solution so that you're giving the policymaker, you're giving them the whole package, and then they can either decide to go off and do it or not, but you're not asking them to decide what you're supposed to be the expert in.
Absolutely. There's a very famous line by President Roosevelt saying that in 5 minutes, he was able to learn from a lobbyist what his assistant tried to explain him over months. Why? Because the lobbyist had the solutions, had constructive arguments and solutions that the assistant had not. The assistants, even of a president, are there to basically give framework, to give terms and conditions, information, but not solutions. Whereas a lobbyist, by definition, is somebody who is really walking into the meeting with one specific ask because there's a problem, and the solution is there, and the solution itself has to remain into the room. I often say, bring a gadget, because your gadget, your little pen, your little thing is going to connect the mind of the decision maker to your solution. So that's the approach.
I just have a question here from Arlene. It would be great, Alberto, to hear your views on involving patients, stroke survivors in advocacy, particularly with decision makers. What is the role of the patient?
Obviously, as we all agree, there is a role for patients, basically because patients have an legitimacy in discussing those issues that nobody else has. So you can hire the best possible lobbyist in Brussels, in Washington, in Dublin, or in Frankfurt, but you're not going to be able to convey the authenticity of a message in the life story of survivors. So this is the way forward, but obviously you need to be extremely aware also that this is sensible. This requires a lot of preparation, again, on the kind of message you want to convey, on the right person, the right tone, the right moment for those patients to speak out. And this is something that I know because I already had the chance to assist and train a few communities of patient advocates. Is not so easy to do, right? We all feel that we need to do it, but on how to frame it, we need definitely to identify best practices. And some of best practices are already present in your community. So you already know more or less the do's and the don'ts, but I think we need to keep searching. We need to keep trying and error, because decision makers are also changing, from a generational perspective, in terms of cultural sensibilities. They perceive the world in a different way. So best practices of 5 years ago might already be a bit outdated. And in that sense, experimentation for me is the key word. Keep experimenting on the best possible way to actually ensure this engagement to be meaningful for both sides, not only for the decision maker and policymakers, but also for stroke survivors themselves, right? Why why they should benefit from it in terms of exposure, in terms of their meaning in their life. That's key.
And just one final question, Alberto, just how can we all stay up to date on the policy process?
Well, I didn't get it.
How can I stay up to date on the policy process?
Right. Well, I give you one advice. I could give you many, but what works very well with me is to set up a Google alert. So if you have a Gmail account, it's for free. You just search Google Alert. You basically add 1 or 2 or 3 keywords between brackets, and automatically every single time there's something that pops out a lot across the web, you're going to get into your inbox. So that's how I keep updated, keep abreast with many developments across policy areas. It's a wonderful tool. You know, in the old days, the monitoring was extremely cumbersome. You had to pay people, organizations to run it. Probably you still have to do it if you want to do it in a very granular, exhaustive way. But, you know, for the kind of approach we have, I think it can be enough for you to have a few Google alerts to just get everything you need in your inbox. You know, you can do it every day or once a week. You just decide your parameters.
Sorry, there's just one last question's come through. With respect to implementation of the Stroke Action Plan for Europe in the different safe member countries, I'm wondering and would like to ask colleagues who have already worked on an advocacy plan where the ESOs, oh, sorry, is that a question for you? Maybe that's a question for everyone else. Sorry, that's a question for everyone else.
It might also be, it might be a good question actually, Chris, for Alberto, about declarations in countries. Do declarations from health ministers, are they, we're obviously trying to do one with the European Stroke Organisation. Alberto, as one of your tools and tactics, are declarations a good thing for us to try and persuade health ministries to sign?
No doubt. Inducing political policymakers to pledge and to commit is always useful, is always a leverage of change, a lever of change for you. But of course, that lever of change also has to be well prepared in terms of substance. It doesn't have to be something empty. It has to be related or supporting or legitimizing some of your solutions or some of your calls. So the more you narrow it down, the kind of declaration, the easier will be to leverage on this in the future, and also to hold accountable that particular political leader or political leaders on that statement. So it's a useful tool, but it's like the meeting. It's not the end of itself. It's a means to a broader end.
Alberto, thanks very much. We really appreciate that. That was really excellent, and something in it there for everyone, no matter how new or how old they are in terms of the advocacy and the lobbying game. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. We're going to take a 5-minute break now, I think, and we'll come back in 5 minutes with Kelsey Beltz's presentation then. Thanks very much, everyone. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you're all still there. Looks like you are. 41 participants. I just see a note from Arlene, who would like to take a photo for Twitter. So I suppose we should do this now, Arlene, should we?
Yeah,
we might
we've got
have a couple of drop-offs towards
yeah.
the end if people have to rush off to do things. So it might be best to do that now. So could we get everyone to come on screen and have their photo taken?
That's amazing. Just a second. So it would be great if everybody who's on, oh gosh, gives me a big wave. Tell me that you're all having fun and you're having a great time, right? That's great. That's one. One more, just a second. I'm going to move you on to the next one. Everybody wave. Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Chris. Now back to serious stuff.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, everyone. Shows us who's paying attention anyway. So next, I'd like to introduce our final speaker today, Kelsey Belts, who is Partnerships and Education Manager at the Good Lobby. She holds a Master's of Public Policy from Sciences Po and has previously worked on education and development with the OECD and NYU Law in Paris. So Kelsey's going to talk about how to turn your case for stroke into a common mission, knowing your added value and infecting others with it. Thank you, Kelsey.
Yes, thank you so much. So it's wonderful to be here today. And I am, as they said, I'm Kelsey Belts. I also work for the Good Lobby. So I work with Alberto. So a lot of my presentation will be a little bit sort of building on a lot of the topics that I think we've already hit today, which is great. And we will mostly be talking about how, now that you have your sort of advocacy plan, how do you turn it into a common mission? How do you get other people involved in your cause? And then we'll also do another sort of case study on a few successful campaigns that are most relevant to us. So just to revise, it's only been a brief 5-minute pause, so I'm sure you remember, but basically, so what we've already discussed both with Emma and Alberto is this idea, we have our battle, we know what we're really working towards, we're working to work on this safe stroke action plan for Europe, implementing it in your own countries. Hopefully we will do our homework, we'll map our stakeholders, and now is really the moment to spread the word. So now that you sort of have your idea, you know who you're trying to talk to, it's really the time to start spreading the message. And I think Alberto has given us a very nice segue because we're going to be talking more about sort of the communications and a little bit about meetings. To start things off, I will say we will be focusing today more on the general public and on potential allies, because in the next session that you'll have later on in June, you're going to talk specifically about discussing with decision makers and media, both of which are sort of very targeted strategies. So for today, we're going to choose our audience, which is very important, but I will be focusing mostly on the general public and sort of public awareness and what that can bring to this stroke action plan. And then also potential allies, not necessarily on a political sphere, but potential allies who can boost our cause. So for the tailored campaign strategy, the first thing, as we've already seen, is to ask who. There's never going to be one communication strategy that you give to everyone. You're not going to approach a politician or a political actor the same way you're going to approach someone on the street, or the same way that you're going to approach a partner who you want to join your campaign. So the first thing you need to really ask yourself is, who am I actually targeting with this particular piece of information? And then the second, which is also very important, and I think almost more important when it comes to sort of medical or patient issues, because as we've already discussed, they're quite technical. So the question of what information should be shared is actually more crucial now than ever. I think, as Emma gave a very good introduction, you don't want to show up to certain stakeholders and give them, you know, your 30-page policy document. I know we have some medical professionals here. But at the same time, you have to be strategic. You also don't want to show up and not give them any facts. So we'll go over, you know, a very key question is, what should I actually bring to this meeting and how should I present it? The context as well, of course, where will this communication take place? I think, you know, when we were both living other lives, we used to go out and have in-person meetings with policymakers, and it was very nice. But that's another thing to consider in these sort of more COVID times. Is it going to be an online meeting? Is it going to be an in-person meeting? Where exactly is that taking place? And then, as always, we have the why, which in some cases I think is a little bit more established, but you really do need to sit down, even if you have your sort of cause and your plan developed, to say, okay, why am I making this particular presentation? You can refer back to your stakeholder maps or your advocacy plans, but generally you should be thinking, for this specific presentation, why am I doing it? And then of course the how, which is more of the logistics, which we'll also look at some examples of some good ones to sort of inspire you. So we'll start, as I said, with the general public, which is more of sort of an awareness raising campaign. And I think in the context of the Safe Action Plan, this is actually very, very relevant, particularly for the sort of the primary and secondary prevention. Because when it comes to prevention, you're seeking, of course, to have also a medical perspective, but this is where you're really trying to reach the public. You're trying to explain daily steps they can take to change their lifestyles, or daily ways they can sort of recognize early symptoms. So it's actually very crucial to have this sort of general public awareness when you're considering your communications. And because it's general public, we have some basic aims. The first, of course, is attention grabbing. I think, as we all know, even sort of before COVID, it's a very charged atmosphere. There's a lot of different things happening on all the time. You turn on your news. So you want to have something that's going to grab the attention of people, that's really going to sort of draw them in. You also, as Alberto has nicely touched upon, and I will sort of expand further, you want to have empathy inspiring. You want to have something that touches people in a way that they're going to walk away and think about a personal connection. And then this, again, in terms of health issues, especially stroke, but sort of overarching, is you want it to be informative in a way that you're actually giving some facts and figures that stick and that are meaningful, but also accessible. You don't want to sort of beat someone over the head with a very long policy document. So we will go into more of all of this later, but if, again, building on Emma, if you want to walk away with certain aims, make it attention grabbing, empathy inspiring, and then informative, but also accessible. So I know that might seem like a lot, but those are sort of the key aspects to consider. So to go into all of this, because I think we've all given you a lot of sort of examples, and Emma had some really lovely examples of patient-focused health, and I think this is also interesting, but we'll use this more of a case study to sort of develop some of the concepts that I'm going more in depth in. So it's from the World Heart Federation. I think many of you might already be familiar with this because it was a pretty big global campaign. And of course, there are some links to stroke as it has to do with cardiovascular disease. But I think this is a really excellent campaign to sort of demonstrate all the different ways that you can grab attention. First and foremost, just having a very simple sort of graphic using heart to beat heart disease, to beat heartbreak. It's very nice. And you can already see at the bottom that they're using hashtags, that it's linked to World Heart Day. So we're going to sort of go through this, and at the same time, I'll show you how it's a good campaign and also give you some tips in ways that you could sort of implement these same things. So again, they have this very strong sort of central message, which is the idea that, of course, you need your heart. So that's the most central message. They're also linking it to sort of broader issues. They're linking it to making better choices, which has to do with prevention, both with stroke, with heart disease, and many other examples. They're also linking it to science. They're linking it to diabetes. We could have very easily also linked, to prevent stroke. They're thanking nurses, which is a way to sort of reach out to others. They're suggesting ways that you could implement it, take the stairs, fighting climate change. I think this is a really nice example of sort of having a central message, but then you link it to other things. You link it well beyond EU or national levels, more of just sort of taking your cause and making it, as we've said, sort of the common cause, making it a cause that's not just for stroke patients, though you are experts and though you're a very positive voice, but to also link it. This is where empathy comes in, with this idea that it's linked to a broader system, economically, in a health perspective, even climate change. So I think they do a very nice job with this. And if we're going a little bit quickly, don't worry, because as we said, we're going to share all of these slides with you. So you'll have plenty of time to sort of go over in more detail, and we will have a Q&A session as well. So I will keep going. But this is another example also of, yes, I think they did a very good job of sort of, well, we will have a session that focuses more on media, but just to show a way that you can make things sort of instantly accessible. They not only created their own posters, but they also give other users the chance to make your own posters. So for instance, if you're trying to implement the stroke plan, action plan for Europe, you could have participants in different countries making their own posters. And so they would all link back to this common action plan, but individual groups or NGOs or even just citizens and patients could sort of make it their own. And I think that's something that's really powerful when it comes, particularly, of course, from the good lobby and citizen lobbying, is this idea that citizens are really participating. It's not just that we create something in the media and you have to watch it. It's this idea that we get to talk about, how is it affecting us? You have examples on phones, you have examples with hashtags, which link things between platforms. And then you also, coming back to sort of data-driven, have this very real concept, which is that cardiovascular disease is, a killer. So it's mixing facts, images, it's letting citizens have their own sort of take on it. And it also, throughout all of it, uses the same heart and the same hashtag. So even with the diverse perspectives, we're all being linked back to the same cause, which is this idea that you need to use and protect your heart. And this is just another example in terms of, again, we'll go back more into social media, I think, in the next module, but the idea that people are interactively using it, they're suggesting suggestions, they're happy World Heart Day. It's really something that's dynamic and sort of moving. And then it's also being used, we're talking a little bit more about social media because it's so powerful. There's obviously so many users and this big potential, but it's also sort of united across print media as well. So that the second someone sees this heart to beat heart, you instantly are thinking of the World Heart Foundation. It's an instant link. And so that was more about sort of the general public and big campaigns, which I think are, in some ways, we know more of them because we see them all day long. And as I said, we'll go into sort of more nitty-gritty detail about those. But there's a different way to pitch to the general public and to pitch to potential partners and allies. And I think Alberto gave us sort of the introduction. I won't go so into coalition building as such, but I think there's a diverse array of partners that we'll sort of look at. There's different ways that you can have partnerships. And you would approach a partner in a different way than you would probably approach the general public, particularly as we've seen with health issues. They're technical, and as patients and as people who have, or people in the medical profession who have this sort of very technical expertise, it can be easy to want to sort of dive straight into all of the nitty-gritty details and sort of giving them all of these hard facts. But at the same time, we still have to keep in mind some of those principles of empathy and all of these other things we've been talking about. But at the same time, you can go a little bit beyond sort of the one photo poster for these types of groups. That being said, you want to have data driven, but that being said, you also want to be concise, particularly if you're approaching partners for financial support, if you're approaching partners to join you as a coalition, if it's a like-minded NGO, if it's an organization that you think would support you, regardless, you want to have the sort of data-driven aspect, but you also need to be concise because they probably have a lot of meetings, right? So some of the best ways to do this is to have, I would say, a leaflet, a fact sheet, something that sort of very concisely gives the most key information, but at the same time, doesn't inundate them. So again, coming back to what Emma said, sort of having key 3 messages or a fact sheet that has the 5 sort of most important statistics in a way that's very legible is one of the best ways to do this. And some of the good news, particularly of working with SAFE and for sort of trying to implement this stroke action plan, is that SAFE actually has some resources. So you can always be looking back, seeing is there statistics that are sort of there I can use? Is there a campaign leaflet that perhaps I can adapt? So you're not working on this alone. But it's a good idea to sort of have these things pre-prepared. As Alberto said, you might be going in with a little bit of nerves. You don't want to be late. You might get in and they might be rushing to something else. So it's good to have these sort of pre-prepared materials to get your point across. And then, as we've said, practicing your empathy. I think this sounds almost silly sometimes coming from patient organizations, because of course you're coming from this point of great empathy. You're in many ways, you're on the front lines. You know, you're the people that are both the most knowledgeable and have the most personal stories. So coming back to Emma's point, I think this is almost the sweet spot because you have so much data to give, but you also have a very real sort of storytelling perspective, which is another thing we'll go into in more detail in the second module. But it's even coming in with this position of a lot of empathy. We still need to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, who might be a really busy businessman or politician who's running around. So it's always a good exercise to sort of ask yourself, you know, why should they be interested in my issue? Why should they be interested in stroke? You know, and it sounds very lobbyist and political to say what's in it for them, but it's also just sort of a grounding question, which is not to say that you have to offer them something specific, but the idea that there's often a trade-off. Maybe they would like to be a partner and be featured as a sponsor, or maybe they would like to have something. So it's not necessarily going in, you know, you have to go into the dark political grounds and offer something up, but it's just coming from a realistic perspective. I see Arlene has asked. Yes, grabbing attention in the terms of fear. This is a tough one, and I think there's been a lot of back and forth because, of course, you don't want to sort of exploit the victimhood, particularly from a patient's perspective. You don't want to paint it as all doom and gloom and sort of having no agency. I would tend away from that, but at the same time, from a health perspective, it has worked. For us, that is a hard thing. I don't even know if I'm necessarily, I don't know if I can certainly speak from a patient's perspective, and I would love to hear actually if anyone who's attending has their own, have you had experiences with sort of painting things as fear-based or more positive-based? I think my instinct would be to say that there's a balance. I think that people tend to smell, not insincerity, but people tend to know when people are sort of peddling into that sort of darker type of pitch. That being said, there is a very real human component that does happen with stroke, and it's not all beautiful. So I don't think we need to paint it as, all roses, but I think that both the general public and partners can kind of tell when fear is being used as a tool. So I would perhaps try to stick to data-driven and empathy without overstepping.
I'm sorry for disrupting your flow there, Kelsey. That was,
No,
it was for the questions at the end, actually.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. But I think that message that you put up earlier about it's striking that balance of having the numbers and the shock and the making people stand up and be aware of it, as well as having supporting messages around the empathy and what we can do. And so I think that balance is really important. But for some reason, it has worked for different fields, but it hasn't worked so much for stroke, cardiovascular, etc., which still people should be concerned about it. So yeah, sorry, Kelsey, I interrupted your flow.
No, not sorry at all. I'm used to looking at the chat and responding, but actually I do think that one of our final case studies will actually maybe show sort of striking the balance in terms of it's not necessarily the easiest thing to look at, but it's also, it doesn't hit that sort of fear note. So we'll keep going. And this is just to sort of build on Alberto's point also. I think we'll have more to come in the coming modules about coalitions. But he definitely had a point in that coalitions, there's different types of partnerships. So there's a coalition where you could enter and you could all be in a formal coalition where you're co-signing petitions, you're co-signing consultation responses. And that's one type. And it actually can lend a lot of credibility, particularly if it's a multi-stakeholder coalition in terms of that you have partners that maybe are not necessarily expected. But at that time, as Alberto said, it's good to have sort of a clear entry and exit strategy, just in case the coalition is not perhaps what you're looking for, and be very clear about the structure and expectations. But I think other types of partnerships in many ways, which we've kind of hit on, are equally powerful. And especially in the health field, you can have alliances, you can have pledges, and what I'll go on to show is you can have champions, which in some ways, particularly from a communications perspective, can be really helpful because it can really amplify your voice without necessarily having to co-sign or co-negotiate every single thing that you sign. So again, we will go into more of this in more detail, but just to keep in mind that having a formal coalition is not the only way to sort of draw in partners. You can have financial partners, you can have research partners, you can have these sort of champions from a communications point of view. And one example of this, to come back to the World Heart Day, is they have these heart heroes, and I believe World Stroke Day does as well. But this is an example of someone that you don't have to be in a formal coalition, but if you can have multiple medical professionals balanced out with people from patients' organizations, balanced out with other types of champions, even influencers or people that are from outside the health sphere, it can really lend this sort of multi-sectoral legitimacy to your cause. And it's also a really nice way to use in communications, because you can do things like this, where you sort of show the champion, you have this alliance, hopefully they share it also on their social media, but at the end of the day, you're not sort of formally in a coalition. So these are all types of things that you can sort of explore. And then, yes, we haven't, I know that the title of this module referenced it a little bit in terms of that we are definitely in a pretty crazy time for health sectors and almost every other sectors. And so I think the elephant in the room for some cases is, of course, that we're living through a global pandemic. And in some ways that's made healthcare much more sort of on the political sphere, but in other ways, maybe it's drowning out some of these voices. We mentioned the way that, of course, cancer is very high on the agenda, but even I think cancer in some places is not necessarily getting the attention. So what happens to stroke? What happens to cardiovascular disease? So this is, again, I think a question that I think we'll have time in the Q&A, and I would love to hear your own perspectives in terms of COVID. Is it, in some ways it can be negative, but it can also be positive. Here's an example of, saying, we are living in a pandemic, so you need to take care of your health more. You need to not have a comorbidity. So there's different ways to think about it, but I would also be very curious to hear your own experiences in terms of whether you think it's helped you in terms of agenda setting, whether you've gotten more meetings, less meetings, because these are definitely questions that I think are on all of our minds at this moment. And then this is the example that perhaps strikes the not necessarily fear mongering, but I think this is I like this example from a breast cancer education, which actually was made in partnership with the patients associations in the Netherlands. In terms of it's showing different signs for preventative care that you could feel from breast cancer. And it's something that sort of gets your attention and in some ways is a little bit shocking, but at the same time, it's not peddling fear in the same way that it would be if it was used in a slightly different context. So I think you can strike a line between showing some sort of real consequences and very real preventative measures without necessarily going fully into the fear spectrum. And what this did have is it actually had from the patient organizations in the Netherlands, it actually had, from one simple image that was sort of circulated, they saw that there was very different understanding in patient behavior, patient confidence. So there's a lot of power that can go into your communications even before you start going into communicating with political actors, so there's a lot to be done. And with that, I'd love to open it up to questions because it seems like we do have a few. I'll just leave you with one bottom line, which is, engaging others, whether it's political actors, whether it's partners, it's always going to be about good communication. So you always need to think about your target audience. And then, yes, sort of striking that sweet spot between empathy, data-driven, and then being accessible is the bottom line. And with that, I will leave it for questions because I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of a discussion then.
Kelsey, thanks a million. That was superb. I mean, just boiling down all those really difficult issues around effective advocacy into the simple steps. But I think the simplicity hides quite a lot of complexity. For example, around what you said at the beginning about communications that are at the same time concise, attention grabbing, and empathetic. How would you advise an organization that doesn't have much background in advocacy and is setting out to promote the Stroke Action Plan for Europe? How would you advise them to go about, boiling their message down into that, almost, I suppose, it's like the sort of the silver bullet of advocacy, really, isn't it?
I know, and it's so easy. And again, I think we almost break this up, and I think we will, into communicating with policymakers and then communicating on social media and then sort of communication. So don't worry if you're looking at this, it's definitely not the last time you'll be hearing about communication. But I do think there's something really to be said about sort of pulling out your 4 key messages, 2, 3, 4, and then figuring out a way to sort of relay them. It doesn't necessarily have to be as attention grabbing as the know your lemons, but I think there's a lot to be said, I would say, about mixing 3 key data points and then making it relatable. So if you can relate it in some way with an image, if you can relate it in some way with a hashtag, and just really trying to distill the 3 main points you would do. I know that's like a very watered down version of communication campaigns, and I promise we will come back to it. But I think it's actually at the core of the day, if you look at the most successful campaigns, they really have distilled several key messages and related it in a way that audiences, will stop on the street to look at the poster.
I have a question here from Marcus Wagner. What are key messages to avoid, like not exactly knowing what you are asking for or talking too much about oneself and not listening, etc.?
I would say, especially because I think a lot of what this will apply to would be in terms of the preventative pillars in the SAFE action plan. So I think when it comes to prevention, something to avoid just sociologically is shame. I think that there's something to be said about giving suggestions and sort of ways that you can improve things without necessarily saying like what you're doing is bad. One example, obviously, of the opposite of that would be these smoking campaigns that have these and there's an example of the sort of doom and gloom, but I don't know if that necessarily applies to all health things. And I think that it can in many ways sort of discourage people from seeking help, which I think actually was reflected in the breast cancer statistics in terms of people were a little bit ashamed. They didn't know if there was something that was wrong in their breast or not, and they didn't want to seek help. So rather than framing it in a way that was really shameful, of just saying, here's something you should look for, here's something that here's one easy way you could do to prevent it without the doom and gloom, I guess would be my perspective. Though I'm open to suggestions because I know it has worked for smoking, but I don't think it works universally.
I think for stroke, there is a message that, yes, it will instill fear, but it's something that people need to know. For example, in Ireland, I think Ireland's particularly high, but it's high in every country. It's estimated that, by our own research, that in SAFE, that the number of strokes in Ireland will increase by 70% by 2035. You know, the newspapers in our country have characterized that as a tsunami of stroke, which if that isn't, you know, going to engender fear, I don't know what is. So, but that's worked for us. But obviously you don't want to be doing it all the time. I think you're totally right about the balance there, that, you know, there's a positive message as well about there is life after stroke. And if you don't give people that hope, what's the point of doing anything really? And, you know, there is hope and things can get better. And that's what we're trying to do, I suppose. And just on that, I think, you know, it's a really key question for me. You know, it's that question around how much should we rely on data versus emotion to engage people for our cause. I think that's almost the $64,000 question.
Yes, that's definitely the $1 million question. And that's the question that's really hard to address just generally. It comes up in almost all of our presentations, even not working on medical issues. But again, I think it comes down to targeting your audience. I think if you're targeting the general public, like I said, I think 2-3 key statistics that are easy to understand, but then having a real sort of emotional pull for someone who maybe, you know, hasn't been thinking about stroke or isn't necessarily at risk of stroke, for them to be able to sort of empathize with why they should care about stroke. It should be perhaps a bit more storytelling driven. Whereas sometimes when you're speaking to people where, for instance, if you're trying to change, you know, post-stroke care and you're speaking mostly to medical professionals, it might be better to really sort of have the hard data behind you. So that's another moment where, you know, targeting your audience is essential. But at the end of the day, it's always going to be a balance. And there's always a benefit to both. You're always going to want to have empathy and storytelling, because at the end of the day, you're not going to get anywhere necessarily with just hard facts, nor with pure empathy. So it is a balance.
What about people who are against our goals? Is it even worth trying to engage with them, or should we ignore people who aren't on our side and just do our own thing?
I think this comes back to, I think Alberto hit it a little more on the stakeholder mapping, but it's always good to know what the people who are theoretically against you are saying. They might not be as, you know, I think in certain cases, they might not be necessarily, that's why it's good to have a stakeholder map. They might not be necessarily against you verbally. It's not like a political battle where they're going to have a, you know, an ad on TV that they're anti-stroke patient. But I think it's good to know that the different groups that are sort of waiting in the wings who might actually be able to block your bills, particularly for whatever reason, for their own sort of, you know, pharmaceutical reasons or any other reasons. It's good to know who's out there, because without it, you'll only be fighting half the fight. And even if you don't address them directly in your communications campaigns, it's definitely good to know what angles they're taking, so you can sort of garner more public attention and more public support for your own cause to sort of counteract that.
I see there's another question on the chat, but I just can't get down to it.
Hold on, I see one. Oh, let me see that. Okay.
Nelson, I think.
What are key mistakes to avoid? Yes, okay, so we got that one. I see from Christina that she said it was more difficult to have awareness campaigns because of COVID, which I've definitely, yes, we've definitely heard that COVID has sort of drowned out some things for sure. But at the same time, like we said, it's also an opportunity to try to leverage. And then the last question I see is for general public communication campaigns, what are some of the ways you can measure? Yes, great. Acknowledging that many SSOs might have limited resource. So I'll let Arlene elaborate, but I think for the last module of this session, we'll be having an entire module devoted to monitoring and evaluation. Yes.
Yes, we will. So come back for the third module and we will tell you and teach you how to evaluate and monitor.
And also engage with policymakers and use media. So this is really sort of the tip of the iceberg today. I know we threw a lot of information at you. It wasn't intended to be necessarily the whole picture, but the good news is that you'll dive in more.
So are there any more questions that anyone has? I don't see any on the chat. If not, we'll end there. And just to say, Kelsey, again, thanks. That was just excellent. It really was really clear, concise, and you know, great advice for us as we're moving into this really important campaign to get the Stroke Alliance for or the Stroke Action Plan for Europe implemented across the various countries in Europe. And again, just to say that, as I said at the outset, you know, everyone's success is shared, and everyone's success feeds into more success and more likelihood of implementation in other countries. And we can, we can help each other by just working even in our own countries, but we can also help each other with examples of good practice and of campaign successes that can be transferred across Europe. And I'm sure Arlene and the SAFE team will be trying to gather those together as we move into this campaign, and making sure that that we spread the sort of the good practice, and we learn the lessons together, and we bring this forward together, and we make sure that it works in every country across our membership. Just to finish up then, I just want to thank all of the speakers again. I mean, it was a really good session. I think that was real expertise there at our disposal, and I think certainly even someone like myself who works directly in the advocacy area, there's lessons and messages there that you just can't get drummed into your head often enough, and it was really helpful to me, and I'm sure it was to everyone else. We're going to be in touch over the next couple of days with a short evaluation survey. We want these sessions obviously to be working to maximum effect for everyone. So we want to hear what you thought about the session today. And then just to mention Module 2, which is happening on June the 3rd. And we need participants to register again for this module, and the link is going to be provided. If it hasn't already been, it's going to be provided in the chat. And then Module 3 is taking place on June the 24th. And again, we're going to need people to register for that, but participants should hopefully save the date in their calendars to make sure they're able to come to it. So unless Arlene has anything extra to add, I will just end the session there. Again, thanks for everyone who's attended. We hope you got a lot out of it. I certainly think I did, and I certainly think that everyone will have. And let's hear your feedback, and let's make these sessions work for us all, as I say. And just finally, again, to thank everyone who organised this session today, again, to the funders, and particularly to the presenters today, who, as I've said, were all excellent. Thanks very much, and we'll see you all soon.